this workshop, and it's important to me, but I think to all involved as well. As I hope you have already started to gather from the first session's talk and the practical, is that the aim of this workshop is kind of twofold. It's about engaging with craftspeople, not only as a means to benefit archaeological or historical research, but it's also extremely important for preserving the heritage of Cyprus. So this afternoon, in the context of pottery, I hope you further embed this notion in your minds. And to do that, I'll first go through the production steps for actually making a pot, moving from the raw materials of the clay all the way to the fire. This introduction to the process will hopefully provide some context for the rest of the presentation. But in addition, during this breakdown of the steps, I will also introduce you to some of the workshops of traditional pottery on Cyprus, describing the ceramic traditions along the way. Now, there are many traditional workshops for ceramics on the island, but I will concentrate primarily on perhaps the most well-known ones of Kornos and Lapithos. And in fact, the potter that will be demonstrating techniques later today is a traditional Lapithos potter. His name is Mihalis Parpas. And the other, Maria Eleneftu, is another who will also be demonstrating. Is a modern potter who also is trained in the traditional techniques. And so I hope you have many questions for them about their ways of making pottery. Both of these two have been my teachers in the last 4 years on this island, and to whom I have often turned for questions about clay, techniques, you name it. They are a wealth of information. So following this breakdown of the sequence to make a pot, I will then take us all the way back to the Bronze Age, which is my area of expertise to some extent. And I will try to guide you through the changes in ceramic production and technology from the early to late Bronze Age, and how Cypriot potters moved from hand making and to wheel making during this time. Finally, and bring it back to the modern day, I will introduce you very briefly to my own research, which as a practicing potter involved me experimentally reproducing some vessels, which you can see some here, in order to interpret the manufacturing techniques and clay recipes used by these ancient Bronze Age potters. Moreover, I'll be demonstrating some of the ancient techniques that may have been in use during this time, using a modern but more traditional type of tool to conduct these kind of experimental reproductions. You also see some of my experimental vessels outside. I'll bring them up with us. And this, I hope, will bring my points of the importance of engaging with craftspeople back around. So, pottery production. In order to get from the clay to the ceramic or a finished product, there are a number of mandatory steps that need to be done first. First of all, you need clay, and most of the time it needs to be processed, then it needs to be formed into shape, left to dry, and then fired. However, as it should be clear from this sequence, there are a number of other side steps that can be taken, and these can be considered actually as technical choices. In other words, there are different actions that can be taken during the full production sequence, which differ within a region of time. Moreover, there are, as I hopefully explained well, a million different ways to make a pot. And it's the choices that the potter makes along this mandatory sequence that we want to understand, study, and analyze. In the literature, the study of these stages is often referred to as chaîne opératoire, which is a concept and method of analysis that goes back to the study of lithics, actually, by French archaeologists and theorists. But in essence, it is a tool or a framework for studying the steps of transforming a raw material to an artifact and picking out the details of the choices made along the way. And I want to stress that it won't be possible to cover all the ways you can make a pot. So I will therefore focus mainly on these mandatory steps here, the ones in black, as well as some aspects, of course, of those which are found often in Cypriot traditional and Bronze Age pottery. So to begin, the first step for any potter is, of course, to acquire some clay. Traditionally, this is done by finding outcrops in the landscape and taking the earth back to a workshop or any place, really, sometimes on site, to be processed. Of course, modern potters can have the luxury of buying clay online nowadays that is pre-processed, but for the more recent past, and even in the last 100 years, clays are often selected from the surrounding landscape, extracted, and submitted to any number of preparation methods. The most common being hand sorting and sieving, both dry and wet. Sorry, I'm blocking one here. This is wet sieving. And levigating. Now, hand sorting and sieving simply means removing any unwanted materials from the clay, which includes things like larger pieces of non-plastic material or non-clay elements from the raw material. Once this stage is complete, it's also possible that these non-plastic inclusions are also processed by crushing or sieving and then added intentionally back into the pot for various reasons. This is called tempering, this practice. So tempering of clays with quartz, for example, is frequently done to increase the clay's thermal resistance, making it less likely to crack under repeated episodes of heating, for example, with your cooking pots. So some other methods of preparation include levigation, as I mentioned, which focuses on the removal of even smaller fractions of non-plastic material. And this is done when the potter desires a very fine clay, which often will be used for smaller pots or clay that will be thrown on the wheel, for example. And in order to do that, the clay is mixed with water and allowed to settle so that the heavy and larger particles settle at the bottom and the finer material can be skimmed off the top into another basin and allowed to dry and then processed. So in Cyprus, the traditional pottery village of Kornos, which is located in the foothills of Troglos Mountains, prior to the mid-20th century, used to source two different raw materials to make their clay paste, a red earth that was found nearby to the village, as well as a finer clay with some elements of sand in it. The localities where these materials were available were called Vines and Apis. During the 20th century and after the mid-20th century, the potting ladies of Kornos switched to a clay that was actually brought from Stavrovouni to the southwest of the village, which, although this was a new source of material, it maintained the distinctive red brick color when fired. So in these two photos, you can see the raw material being prepared and mixed with the modern grinding machine here. And next with the hydrated clay being cured, but also ready to be used to make pots at a moment's notice. Now, at Lapithos, by contrast, there are several workshops located on the northern slopes of the Pentadactylos, and the clays there are renowned to be of the finest quality on the island. Now, these often very fine clays did not need to be mixed as often, and instead could be submitted directly to levigation or what's called decantation. And of course, after 1974, the Lapithos potters were displaced and forced to search for new clay sources. So one, Panagiotis Parpas, the father of Michalis, for example, selected and mixed clays from around the area of Aglanja in Nicosia. So once the potter has the clay, it's time for it to be shaped. And I show you here quickly just how many different ways there are to shape clay. This diagram is, of course, not exhaustive in any way, but I hope it demonstrates the complexity, primarily because there are so many different combinations of techniques that can be done, whether using it by hand only or by wheel only or mixing some of the two together. In most cases, the manufacturing techniques are split into primary and secondary forming, which means making a rough shape first with one technique and then finishing the shaping with another, to put it very simply. So in terms of hand making, some of the most common ways to shape clay is by using coils, by pinching, slab making, mold making, or by the aid of a turntable. But coiling is perhaps the most common one to be seen, and involves the rolling out of clay into long or short cylinders. They can also be rectangular. There is really no fixed way to make a coil, and they can be stacked and joined and smoothed with the hands or with tools. So there's a lot of variety there too. There are also several ways of stacking them and using them. For example, if you look from left to right, we have spiral coiling here, more traditional coiling here, and then the Kornos style here. So in that aspect, with the turntable, can also be very useful for coiling, because it allows the potter to remain stationary while the pot moves, rather than the potter moving around the pot. So now something that I'm going to talk about a bit later is the introduction of the potter's wheel to Cyprus, and this will also be demonstrated outside, which is very cool. So it's important to note the major differences between hand making and wheel making, and it's basically the use of what is sometimes called rotative kinetic energy. There are several ways to make a pot on the wheel, but the most important distinguishing point between wheel making and the use of, for example, a turntable is this concept of rotative kinetic energy, in that the potter's hands need to be stable and allow the clay to move around the hands, rather than the potter actively pinching and moving their hands to form the clay into shape, if that makes sense. So like hand making, there are also many different ways to use the wheel. There is wheel coiling, for example, which can be seen in the middle, where potters put large or small coils onto a base and then use the wheel's momentum to join the coils together and throw them up into shape. Of course, there's also pure wheel throwing, which Michalis and Maria will show later on. Whereas for me, I will show you more of the wheel coiling or wheel finishing techniques that were more likely to be used in the Bronze Age on Cyprus. So in the traditional workshops of Cyprus, there are a number of techniques used to make pottery that range also from hand making with coils to wheel throwing. At the workshops of Kornos, the potters use a turntable and what can be described as a combination technique, one in which coils are joined together and later the shape is refined by spinning the turntable. This technique is sometimes referred to as wheel finishing. Here you can see two examples of the potters at Kornos finishing their vessels here with the rag and here with her hands. At Lapithos, on the other hand, the primary technique used by the multitude of the workshops there in and around the village of Lapithos was wheel throwing using a kick wheel. In other words, starting from a ball of clay, centering it, opening it, raising up the walls, and then creating the shape. And it's worth emphasizing that there were several workshops located on these slopes around Kyrenia, and many of the potters, although they use the same overall technique, they all, and it's the same for Kornos as well, they all have their unique hand gestures, movements, and shape styles that make their work distinctive. And sometimes you can figure them out if you have a trained eye. Now, when it comes to studying ancient pottery, the aim is often to try and interpret these different techniques and gestures from the traces left behind on the pots. These different methods therefore correspond to different traces left behind on the surfaces that archaeologists will look for and, of course, record. For instance, when you have full pots, it can sometimes be quite clear the method of manufacture, but correct identification of these traces also relies on having an experimental dataset. So, for instance, this plain white bowl or crater has some clear coil joints that seem to appear on the surface as a result of incomplete joining of two pieces on the wheel. However, as it is a full pot, the question of what technique was used should remain open-ended because we can't simply know the exact method used back then, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But one way to narrow down which technique was used is with both full pots and shared material. This way things can be seen both in section and as a whole, and this is also a core part of my research that I will talk about today. So for example, on the left, not right, left, is a freshly made coil pot from the village of Kornos. Since I actually watched the potter make this vessel, I can pretty safely identify that the pot was coil made, but on the exterior, at least, there are not really any coil seams to give that impression, if you see what I mean. What we do see are lines known as smoothing marks and striations along the exterior. So, interior, here and here. In contrast with the archaeological shred material on the right, we see what are known as throwing lines or concentric rilling, meaning that the lines are parallel to each other all the way up the vessel. In some circumstances, it may be possible to see a combination technique, which reveals the join between two segments of a vessel, such as between the neck and the shoulder. This is a common place for these kind of traces to appear. And you can see here an example, possible example here. So once the clay has been formed into the desired shape, there are also a number of pre-firing surface treatments that can be done, which include burnishing or polishing here, incising or slipping. For burnishing and polishing, it means basically rubbing the surface of the vessel repeatedly with the tool until there is an observable shine to the surface. This early Cypriot type of pottery here is one example. You can see the luster on it. And what is basically happening is when you're burnishing, you're aligning the clay sheets together along the surface to make it more likely to reflect light. And this is what creates this shine. Now, incising is another type of technique, which is often found in early Cypriot pottery. And it simply involves taking a sharp object, wood, stone, or anything really, and scratching it into the surface. However, this must be done before firing, otherwise it's going to be really difficult for you. So, finally, once you have your almost finished product, it needs to be fired in order to be called ceramic, which means that the clay has undergone an irreversible process. It means all of the water has been removed from the clay, even the water between the microscopic sheets, which have then become fused. Now, this actually can happen at different temperatures, depending on the type of clay, but by and large, it occurs at temperatures above 575 degrees Celsius. For example, porcelain and stoneware clays, the latter of which I will be using a bit later in the practical, can withstand very high temperatures of around 1100, 1200 degrees. Whereas a simple earthenware or red clay, for example, like from Kornos, might be fired around 800 degrees because afterwards it might begin to melt. So scientific techniques can also help clarify these temperatures because you can actually look microscopically at the clay sheets. This is called scanning electron microscopy. And it shows you just how much these sheets have melted or vitrified. So in terms of firing technologies at Kornos and Lapithos, the shape, design, and size of these kilns were pretty varied over time in both villages. In general, though, both were using updraft kilns that were of a medium size and were suitable for a variety of small to medium vessels. They were, of course, not the same kind as those used for making pefaria, like in the village of Fini, for example, which are much larger. But it is worth noting that traditional kilns used by each village were in fact somewhat similar in design for a very short period of time around the early 20th century, in the sense that they were both freestanding, domed or tholos kilns that were made from bricks with a coating of mud and straw. Now, the types of pots and the clays that they were using also determined the temperatures that they aimed for when conducting a firing. For Kornos, the clay was limited to around 800 degrees, as I said, before the ceramic would start to slump, melt, and vitrify. At Lapithos, the temperatures were marginally higher and in two stages, because as some of you will probably know, this village is well known for its glazed pottery, which required higher temperatures for the correct outcome. So now that you've had a very, very brief introduction on how to make a pot and some idea of the variety of techniques used by traditional potters in Cyprus, I would like to go back in time to the Bronze Age, when the ceramic technologies of the island were in transition from handmaking to the introduction of wheel making, which is the subject of my research. And of course, because I have to make my work sound interesting, the transition is not so simple as one technique overtaking the other. But first, when is the Bronze Age on Cyprus? So it roughly corresponds to around 2400 to around 1100 BCE, and it's split into a tripartite scheme that was developed by Swedish archaeologist Einar Gerstad sometime in the 1920s. And these divisions were originally developed and founded upon changes in the ceramics, their styles, and wares. More recently, though, these times have shifted with more modern scientific dating techniques like radiocarbon dating, and of course by new excavations. My research in particular is primarily focused on the late Bronze Age, but rather than focusing specifically on this period, the smaller period of history on the island, I thought it would be more interesting to go over some of the major ceramic changes that occurred throughout the Bronze Age, and how ceramic technology shifted from handmaking almost exclusively, to a kaleidoscope really of techniques in the late Bronze Age, which included the potter's wheel, a technique and a tool that would persist in use on the island up until today. So it's also worth keeping in mind the changes in technology can also reflect other aspects of society. There is a wealth of literature on the social aspects of technology, and especially how these technologies are learned, exchanged, and adapted over time. I should stress that these earlier periods are not my specialty, but I will do my best to convey the most critical points. So beginning with just before the late Bronze Age, or the Chalcolithic period, some significant changes can be observed from the ceramics. Firstly, we see rounded vessels or rounded bottom vessels without handles, no fire applied directly for boiling liquids, and a wealth of painted decoration. Now, sometime around 2900 or the early to middle Chalcolithic period, we see the arrival of new, thinner walled and harder monochrome vessels that appear with what look like lug handles here, but not proper handles. And it's only by the early Bronze Age that we see specifically made cooking pots, vessels with proper handles attached, new types of decoration, and distinct regional styles. And it's important that the arrival of cooking pots and handles signals very clear changes in cooking practices. So social aspects. Now, the key markers of the early Bronze Age on Cyprus include the introduction of new technologies from metalworking, architecture, food, processing, textiles, and of course, pottery. One critical aspect is the arrival of the so-called Filia phase, which Raphael can probably give us more information about later if he wants. In general, it's characterized by being a transitional period between the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, but this is, of course, still debated. But I want to say ask why this phase is important. Firstly, it's because red polished ware emerges for the first time, and this would continue all the way up to the beginning of the late Bronze Age, or around 1750 BCE. Technologically, it's also important because, like the Middle to late Bronze Age transition, which I will talk about later, it marks a significant shift in the aesthetics of pottery on Cyprus, from more painted white wares to these red polished, burnished potteries. Although, of course, it experienced both stylistic and technological developments, in general, filial pottery is described as being soft-fired and handmade from calcareous or calcium-rich clays. Now, as I mentioned, red polished ware would continue after its introduction in the filial phase, but would soon begin to show development of styles through time, as well as evidence of exchange and signs of regionalization. Types from the northern coast of the island were rich in shape diversity and were often soft-fired and made from levigated clays. In contrast, the red polished wares from the southern or central were often gritty, hard-fired, and made from an igneous clay with mottled surface treatment. Some examples here. And sometime around BC3 or around 2000 BCE, there seemed to have been an island-wide tradition forming, which showed an increase in standards of manufacture for this ware specifically. So in the Middle Bronze Age, Cypriot pottery largely keeps this appearance of red polished ware, but develops new forms, such as the wishbone handle, which you can see in the center here, new decorative techniques, such as incising, and technologies, for example, this multi-pronged tool. I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can see here some incise with a three-pronged metal tool, which is a new thing. There is also the appearance of new non-red wares in the Middle Cypriot period, such as white painted ware and plain white, but there's not time to talk about everything. So instead, I would like to briefly talk about the technology of making red polished ware. It's often made from different clays, depending on the region, of course. For example, they use these red volcanic clays from the Troodos for the larger vessels, and sometimes finer sedimentary clays for the smaller, thinner walled vessels. And of course, they also used a range of preparation methods, from hand sieving most likely, to also levigation. In terms of techniques, they were using primarily coiling, pinching, or molding, with this Cypriot unique handle technique called push-through handle, so pushing the handle through the wall of the vessel. Very characteristic. And for the pre-firing surface treatments, they used a thick slip or a slurry of clay and a stone or other object to burnish the surface, giving it their distinctive luster or shine. Now, some major changes include not only develops in red polish ware stylistically, but technologically, because they reflect the introduction of this levigation of clays, which is a very different technique to just hand sorting, as I mentioned before. But the other thing is that slips also get thicker at this time as well, for this very, very red appearance. And this is evidenced primarily at sites like Marquis and Alhambra, for example. And also, there are higher firing temperatures being achieved. As we can see, for example, in this SEM image, the early Bronze Age shirt, you can see that the clay sheets are very angular, very well formed. But if we move to the Bronze Age shirt, the Middle Bronze Age shirt, you see that the structure has been lost and they are starting to melt and vitrify, which signals higher temperatures. And lastly, I want to say that for early and Middle Bronze Age pottery, we see very little evidence of turntable use. So it seems that they're not really using a rotative device. And this is important because at the beginning of the late Bronze Age, which runs from around 1700 to 1100 BCE, we see the introduction of the potter's wheel to Cyprus, including a range of new wares, not just plain white. We see bichrome. We also see new handmade wares like baize ring and white slip ware. So a lot of things going on in the late Bronze Age that are new. These new handmade wares are also very important for several reasons. Baize ring, for example, was not only one of the most popular tablewares of the late Bronze Age, it also marks an important technological shift in the tradition of hand-making pots on the island. It marks the use of a turntable to aid the hand-making of pottery for the first time. And the traces of these pots often led some to initially assume that they were wheel-made, but they were not. There are clear traces left on the inside of these pots that suggest the use of a turntable for secondary forming procedures. So scraping and smoothing and helping to reduce wall thickness. Base ring pottery in general is very thin walled, though it's not really tell that from the photos. Now, another new handmade ware is white slip. It's one of the most iconic types produced during the late Bronze Age. Like base ring, it was also exported in high quantities around the Eastern Mediterranean. However, this ware denotes the development of different technological advancements in pottery production. Unlike base ring, it was not produced using a turntable, most likely. Instead, white slip is significant for being significantly higher fired than other wares of this time period, likely reaching temperatures of above 1000 degrees Celsius, a feat which was not so easy and is commonly associated with the copper smelting and copper production on the island during the late Bronze Age. Secondly, it also involved the use and preparation of special raw materials. The potters making white slip specifically sought a white clay, which had properties that could not only withstand these higher temperatures, but also give it its distinctive appearance of very white. Now, at the beginning of the late Bronze Age, there was also the introduction of the wheel. But unlike other areas in the Eastern Mediterranean, as soon as the wheel arrived on Cyprus, it was applied to a variety of wares, not only fine wares, so including very utilitarian pottery like plain white and red and black slip. And so in a sense, you can consider this introduction quite abrupt because they were using it for many wares and many shapes, from small to large. So in contrast to other areas, for example, on Crete, there was a gradual progression of smaller to larger shapes when learning how to use the wheel. But this is not the case on Cyprus. So Cyprus is a very unique case. Now, it's also likely as well that potters were using mostly combination techniques such as wheel coiling. And in some cases, it was apparent that actually the vessels they appear on the outside to be wheel made, but in fact, if you look closely at the interior traces, they were completely handmade. So there is a sense that that looking wheel made was also very important rather than actually being wheel made. So therefore, this transition from hand making to wheel making is really not clear cut. And so in my research, I investigate the late Bronze Age period on Cyprus, when these new techniques and tools were arriving to the island. And to do that, I use both experimental archaeology, which draws on my experience as a potter, and consulting with traditional potters like Michalis and Maria, as well as archaeological science. Now, I won't go into the detail of the scientific methods I use, but I would just like to summarize a little bit my research, what I have found, and finally, how I have used this combination of methods, this methodology, with discussions with traditional potters to better interpret the techniques used by ancient craftspeople. So the first case study that I examined, which you might know, was the site of Enkumi, a very well-known late Bronze Age settlement, during which it was a large coastal trading hub that eventually became a substantial urban center and a very politically powerful entity on the island, most likely. The archaeological site was excavated several times throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but actually the late Bronze Age city was not found until the excavations of Porphyrios Dikios in Kalochifur sometime in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, the second case study site that I examined is less well known for its late Bronze Age character and more commonly known for its more recent history and the unfinished church of Aos Mamas. However, during the late Bronze Age, it was a large inland settlement with several multifunctional complexes and fortresses that commanded the valley, and secured what was likely a strong agricultural economy at the site. The site is also one of the few on the island that produced evidence for pottery production, especially in the late Bronze Age, in the form of a kiln attached to one of the localities called Kirkus. Here, to give one example. Even Enkumi doesn't have evidence for pottery production. That's saying something. So the aim of my research to date has been to try and answer these 5 questions, but you don't need to pay too much attention to them. In the simplest terms, I aim to investigate the transition from handmaking to wheel-making pottery on the island through the study of plain everyday wares, such as some of the ones shown here, plain white handmade pithos, red and black slip, and plain white, etc. And now, in order to do that, I used again archaeological science techniques such as ceramic petrography and geochemistry, which were teamed with experimental archaeology and clay sampling, in order to find out what were the local traditions at each settlement during the Bronze Age. In other words, trying to find out, the clay recipe and identify the manufacturing techniques. And it's most recently in this postdoc at Carey that I've had the opportunity to go more in depth into the analysis of the manufacturing methods at the site of Iosizomynos with experimentation. And this is what I will end my presentation with. But first, to give you a brief overview of my PhD work, at the site of Enkumi, for example, having gathered an exhaustive number of samples of plain wares from the site and submitting them to a range of analytical techniques like ceramic petrography, there were several key takeaways that I found. Firstly, there seemed to have been multiple workshops around Enkumi rather than a singular one located within the site. And these potters were utilizing locally available raw materials that were tempered with a sand rich in igneous rock fragments and microfossils, carbonates. Importantly, it seems that these different workshops were using the same raw materials and very similar recipes throughout the late Bronze Age, and despite the fact that they were probably using different manufacturing techniques. So although they were making pottery differently, they were sharing resources or sharing ideas about resources. And at the site of Enkumi, wheel-making pottery tends to be predominant at the site. So wheel coil, these sort of methods. At Iosizomynos, on the other hand, there is a similar but slightly different story. Here, the potters were also using clay with sand that could be found adjacent to the settlement. However, the inhabitants of this site seem to have been making their own pottery, of course, as well as importing some from the east. And the potters at Iosizomynos, at least for making these plain wares, seem to have used wheel coiling or wheel making techniques much less than at Enkumi. And it was only really possible to identify these imports, actually, I should say, thanks to the ceramic petrographic analysis, which demonstrated that the locally made pots were full of larger igneous rocks, reflecting their proximity to the Troglos Mountains, and correspondingly less carbonates or microfossils. And one of the key ways that allowed me to come to this conclusion, in addition to analyzing material from both sites, was through experimental archaeology. In my PhD, I was able to select sediments or clays and sands from around the site of Iosizomynos, which provided me with a clear picture of the locally available raw materials. This map here shows you the 11 sampling locations. And on the left, you can see some of the raw material in its unfired form here. And then its fired form, which are shaped into what are called briquettes, just basically square ceramic objects. And so after preparing this raw material and firing to turn it irreversibly into ceramic, it was possible to use, again, petrography to compare the archaeological with the geological material, and together help identify which pots were local and which were not. So, for example, in these micrographs on the left, even with an untrained eye, it's pretty clear the similarities between these two inclusions. This is of the archaeological site, and this one is found sand found adjacent to Iosizomynos, which is great. It's very clear. Now, turning now to the manufacturing techniques, tools, there was one significant issue when studying this technology on Cyprus, especially in the late Bronze Age. We simply lack the material evidence of the wheel. To date, there's only been one found at Pila. It's this one here. It's in the Larnaca Museum. But this one comes from the very end of the late Bronze Age. And so our understanding of how this tool and the technique developed up until this point must come from indirect evidence, such as examining clay recipes, as I just described, but most importantly, from analyzing the macroscopic traces left behind on sherds through experimental archaeology as well. So, for example, at Iosizomynos, they seemed again to have preferred to wheel coil or wheel finish their vessels. And to identify these techniques, it was necessary to analyze the macroscopic traces. And secondly, as I mentioned before, there are several combination techniques, and wheel making can mean a variety of things. At Iosizomynos, this assemblage is primarily wheel coiled, and this is evident in several sherds, as you can see here. These undulations in wall thickness, like this, are often characteristic of the joining of coils on the wheel, which tend to get pulled apart during the shaping or widening of the vessel walls. Other macroscopic traces that can be found that are indicative of this technique include fine parallel striations and drag lines, such as this one here. This is a drag line, and these are fine parallel striations. Yeah, these basically suggest that some sort of rotation was being used and that the hands were stable rather than the hands moving and doing things like that. Several vessels, though, almost half actually, also have the appearance of being entirely handmade and simply finished with the wheel. For example, they have discontinuities in wall thickness, evidence of improperly joined coils, and smoothing marks that are not always parallel, but have more random directions. In some cases, it's possible to see both random and parallel smoothing marks on the same vessel surface, which may indicate that the pot was handmade, but then eventually aided by some rotation. However, whether this was done on the same wheel as those wheel coiling is not really possible to accurately address because we simply don't have the evidence. But what is curious is that, as I mentioned before, most pots of the Late Bronze Age were handmade. Before the Late Bronze Age, they were handmade, but many of them don't seem to show signs of any use of rotation prior to this period. In other words, not even the use of a turntable. And so it really must be considered that at this time, the Late Bronze Age, while the handmaking tradition of pottery continued, there's a lot more research needed to assess how it was modified by the introduction of the wheel, and more specifically, by the introduction of rotation to handmaking. I suppose now that I'm coming to the end of my talk, I should probably explain a little bit about what experimental archaeology is and how it is used. In essence, it is an analogical method similar to ethnoarchaeology, which Raphael introduced us to this morning, but it aims to reproduce the past tools, techniques, processes, and objects. And it often lies on this spectrum between isolating specific aspects of an artifact or the raw materials and their properties, and seeking to replicate in as much detail and accuracy as possible the tools, materials, and techniques used by past peoples. My research sits somewhere in the middle. As I have explained, that I use both scientific methods of analysis to study ancient pottery, but I'm also trying to use tools and techniques that might have been more closely resembling those used in the past, like a turntable, which I will show you outside. And so in my experiments so far, I have aimed to use an electric wheel, which is a poor analogy for ancient pottery making, a modern kick wheel, which I couldn't bring for you today, I'm sorry, which is a weak but more suitable analogy, and lastly, a simple Corno-style turntable, which is still an even stronger analogy, but still also inaccurate to the ancient techniques. And so I have combined the use of these different types of wheels and turntables with different manufacturing techniques, such as coil building and wheel coiling, which researchers have identified from the archaeological materials, myself included. So I'm not going to show you any more photos of different manufacturing techniques because after the break, I'll actually be able to show them to you in person. And as I hope you can see here with the video, I'm using a kick wheel. Although it is a modern kick wheel made in the 1980s, it still clearly must be propelled by a foot. And as such, the first observation that can be made is that the wheel is off to one side, which means that when making a vessel, the center of mass of the clay is not right in front of you. In other words, it's not aligned with you as the potter. And this required me to adjust how I make pottery, as I was trained to throw with the clay right in the center rather than to one side. Secondly, the ability to move the wheel in both directions, clockwise and counterclockwise, with ease, makes joining the coils together much easier and affords the opportunity to join them quickly, first of all, and then use the consistent rotation to completely join them, thin them out, and then finally create your shape. I would have liked to show you more of the hand gestures, but it's quite difficult to photograph my own hands while making vessels. But of course, I'll be able to show them to you firsthand, which is great. In any case, in the video, you can see me thinning out the walls and trying to keep the vessel centered while I drop the clay. However, there's a lot of more experimental work to be done on not only on how potters were using the wheel, of course, but also how these past potters were learning to use the wheel for the first time and how they were adjusting their old techniques to new ones. And so this afternoon, I will not be able to demonstrate all of the possible techniques used by ancient potters, but I will be able to introduce you to the traditional and modern pottery of Cyprus by two masters from whom I've learned so much, and to whom I'm very grateful for them to be here today. So thank you very much for listening.